the heat. Okay, fantastic. Welcome back, everyone. I hope you've all managed to at least get outside for a little bit of air, if there's any out there, and get a cold drink. Okay, I have the pleasure of welcoming Professor Jonathan Glassard to the session today. Really warm welcome to Jonathan, who's coming to do our Ask the Expert session. But I'm going to give a little bit of an intro for Jonathan, so you know a little bit more background. I know Laura gave you some of that this morning, but then Jonathan's going to do a brief presentation for us for about half an hour. Then we're going to have some time for some kind of key questions that I've already shared ahead of time with Jonathan. So we'll go through those, and then we're going to open it up to you guys, so you can either raise your hands or pop your questions in the chat towards the end of the session, or pop them in as they come to you as we go through the session, and we'll get back to them at the end. Okay, fantastic. So welcome to Jonathan. Jonathan is Professor of Teacher Education and Head of Department at Primary and Childhood Education at Edge Hill University. He's Director for the...
Sorry, I'm not anymore. I'm at Hull. I'm at the University of Hull.
I knew some of it would be out of date already, Jonathan. Sorry, apologies. You're at University of Hull.
Yeah,
fantastic, fantastic.
Sorry,
so Jonathan, no, it's fine. I did say, let me know if I say anything incorrect. Jonathan began his career as a teacher at primary schools in Barnsley before becoming a senior lecturer at University of Huddersfield in 2005. He's got over 25 years of teaching experience, and his research focuses on a broad range of topics and disciplines, including mental health, LGBTQ+, inclusion, special educational needs, critical disability studies, critical psychology, sociology, and early literacy development. He's a teacher educator and has extensive experience in leading primary ITE programs and in IT quality assurance across primary and secondary courses. He teaches on education. Is this all still the same, Jonathan? Education programs, masters, doctoral levels. We're just delighted to have you with us, Jonathan. You've got so much expertise to share with us, and we're really, really looking forward to hearing what you've got to say and getting a chance to think through some of the ideas and concepts we've been chewing the fat over these conference Saturdays.
Okay, thank you. Hi everyone, I'm really pleased to have the opportunity to talk to you this morning. I'll just try and share my slides. 1 second. Right, so we're going to go into a short presentation. Hopefully, I think you might be seeing my emails. Right, hopefully you can see those. Right, has that worked, Han?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
All good.
Right, so quick presentation. So I apologise in advance if I use terminology that comes from England rather than Wales. We've just been having a chat about this. So the terminology in Wales is obviously different. So, for example, in England, we use special educational needs. You use additional learning needs. We have a SEND code of practice. You have an ALN code of practice. We have education and healthcare plans. You have individual development plans. So, but essentially, I think the principles are the same. I think it's just a difference in terminology. I think Wales is slightly more advanced in terms of curriculum than England, in terms of the curriculum being more inclusive. I think England still has a way to go on that. And I think there's a much bigger focus on well-being and mental health in the Welsh curriculum, and also in the Welsh inspection framework compared to England. So there are some differences, but I think in the main, it's a terminology difference. So I'm just going to start by saying that inclusion is obviously broader than SEND, or additional learning needs. So if we broaden out inclusion, yes, it includes SEND and it includes additional learning needs, but it also includes race, ethnicity, LGBTQIA, poverty, and so on. So we've got to think about how we meet the needs of all of those learners. Okay, so I'm also going to argue that inclusion requires a pedagogical response from practitioners, and it's got to be proactive. So it's not just a case of children slotting into a system that's ready-made for them. There has to be some kind of response from the educators to meet the needs of those children. So inclusion is much broader than integration. It's not about children slotting in. It's about changing the teaching and changing the learning to meet the needs of the child. So it's much more of a proactive response. However, a pedagogical response by teachers will only take inclusion so far. So teachers can, I'm going to argue, can only do so much, because inclusion also is political. It requires a political response. In other words, it requires a transformation of the structures that underpin the education system. Because, and particularly within England, what we've got is we've got really great teachers that are trying to do really, really good inclusive practice in the classroom, but they're working within a system, they're working within a curriculum that doesn't necessarily meet the needs of all children, and they're working within an assessment system that sorts children into successes and failures. And that privileges academic attainment, which doesn't necessarily meet the needs of all learners. So I'm therefore going to argue that teachers and all educators can only go so far. So a pedagogical response alone is not enough. We need that political transformation of the structures that underpin the education system. Okay. And often when people think about inclusion, they think about equality. But I'm going to argue that not all children need the same treatment. Some children need additional support. They need additional resources to access the same curriculum as their peers. And therefore, I'm going to argue that inclusion is much more about equity rather than equality, because equality is about giving everybody the same. But actually, some children need something slightly different. They might need some modifications, they might need some additional resources, they might need some additional support. So that is more about equity rather than equality. And some children need, I will argue, a different curriculum. So some children need, sorry, I don't know what's going on there. Whoops. Why has that come up? Right, 1 second. Oh, I don't know what's going on. Whoops. Right, just bear with me. Right, let me go back. There we go. Apologies. So I think what we can do, if we go back to that middle box there, some children do need additional support and additional resources to access the same curriculum. And if they can access the same curriculum as their peers, then that's all well and good. And making those slight adjustments is more to do with equity. However, some children actually require a different curriculum. So it's all well and good to say, we need to give children additional resources and additional support to enable them to access the same curriculum as everybody else. When actually what we know is that some children, because of their developmental stage, need a much more personalised curriculum and a different curriculum to meet their needs. But I think in the main, the principle that we go with is that children by and large should be following the same curriculum, with those adaptations in place, with that support and those resources, and that those adaptive teaching strategies in place. But actually, sometimes we need to think about doing things differently and giving them a different curriculum. So just to go through those, I'm sure you've seen this before, but equality, if you look at that first picture, is about giving everybody the same. So they've all got the same step up, if you like. But actually, that doesn't necessarily mean that they can all see the game and that they can all therefore experience the joy of watching the game. So just by giving everybody the same doesn't necessarily enable learners to thrive. Whereas equity is about recognizing that actually some children need one step up or two steps up. They need further support to enable them to access that same curriculum and access that learning that everybody else is accessing and enjoying. But the reality, of course, with the education system is that some learners are often have a great step up and are allowed to thrive, and some learners are actually marginalised by the system because of the barriers that are in place. And I think particularly the most vulnerable learners, the reality is that they don't get the support and they don't get the help and they don't get all the resources that they need to enable them to properly access that learning, whereas other learners are allowed to thrive in that system. So in England, we know that the SEND system is at breaking point. I'm not sure what it's like in Wales, but I wrote an article, I've done a hyperlink there to the article about the situation in England. So essentially the situation is that since COVID, there's more and more children with special educational needs. There's more and more children with complex needs now in mainstream schools. The government haven't got the funding to actually fund all the children who need, you would call them individual development plans, we call them education and healthcare plans. There isn't the funding available to ensure that all of those children get funded and get the support. There's even talk now in England of removing education and healthcare plans for children in mainstream schools and only having them for children in special schools. So we're in this emergency situation, and the situation now is that teachers are being told that they must see themselves as experts or teachers of special educational needs, that all teachers must see themselves as teachers of additional learning needs or special educational needs. And that's all well and good. However, teachers have always educated children with additional learning needs. So this is nothing new. They've always supported children with additional learning needs and special educational needs. So suddenly to be told, well, you must now see yourselves as teachers of special educational needs is a bit patronising. But also what that does is that masks the problem of the fact that against that backdrop, we have lack of services, we have a lack of speech and language therapists, we have a lack of educational psychologists, we have a social care system that's crumbling, we have mental health services that are not able to meet demand, special needs services that are not able to meet demand. So actually all the focus now is on schools, and there's less and less external support available for those teachers in schools. And what the government is saying is that we need much more SEND training in initial teacher training so that all teachers can see themselves as experts in SEND. Now, it could be argued that what the government are trying to do in England is they're trying to do inclusion on the cheap, because they're not investing in those services that schools rely on, but also they're not going to invest in any additional specialist provision for children with additional learning needs. And therefore, all the expectation now is being placed on schools. And yeah, it's a really, really system at breaking point. So I just wanted to highlight that. I do have a bit of an issue with the term adaptive teaching, because it could be argued that if we need to adapt the curriculum to meet the needs of children with additional learning needs, this suggests that the curriculum itself is not inclusive at the point of its design. So as a piece of blue sky thinking, why not design the curriculum with inclusion in mind from the outset? So that actually when we design a curriculum, the curriculum is inclusive and therefore doesn't need to be adapted, because what we know is if we get an inclusive curriculum that meets the needs of children with additional learning needs, then that will meet the needs of all children, because often what works for children with additional learning needs will work for all children. So in England, we have a curriculum that isn't inclusive. There's a curriculum review going on at the moment, but there's also a SEND review going on at the moment, and those two bodies are not actually speaking to each other, which is interesting. Now, I think that you know this better than I, but I think the curriculum in Wales is more inclusive than in England. I think there's a much more focus on meeting the holistic needs of children and much more focus on mental health and well-being. But I do have this issue with the term adaptive teaching or adaptive curriculum, because it's kind of suggesting that, well, the curriculum or the teaching isn't inclusive to start with if we need to adapt it. So that's an interesting line of thought. So strategies that I think work for children with additional learning needs is, and you can add to this, but I've just started it here, breaking down the content so that we don't overload them. So reducing cognitive load, giving them opportunities to overlearn. So lots of opportunities to revisit learning and to revisit it in different ways so that they develop automaticity. Pre-teaching some of the knowledge or some of the subject concepts, or pre-teaching some of the vocabulary can be helpful, or just introducing children to a text before a lesson, a book before a lesson, a storybook can be quite helpful sometimes, and then providing scaffolding and then removing scaffolding when the child is confident, essentially. So I could have added to that. I could have said, well, multisensory teaching, multisensory learning is actually helpful for children with additional learning needs. There's lots of strategies that you will know about. But what we need to do is make sure the curriculum is inclusive from the outset and that the assessment system is inclusive. So we go back to that political response. Inclusion can't just rely on a pedagogical response. It needs that political response so that the structures that underpin the education system, i.e. curriculum and assessment, are actually inclusive. And I just want to problematize this word needs. So we often talk about children with needs. So children have behaviour needs or mental health needs or speech and language needs. And this raises a problem because if you say that a child's got needs, that kind of puts the issue with the child. It's positioning the problem within the child or within the person, particularly when you say this child's got behaviour needs. Now, this book, which is a very old book now, but by Thomas and Loxley, they did a really good chapter on really unpicking needs and talking about the problems with the terminology of needs. And they used the example of behaviour needs, and they said, well, a child's, children are discussed as having behaviour needs, but actually, whose needs are they? Is it the needs of the child, or is it the needs of the school to have compliant children? Is it the needs of the education system to have compliant children, or is it the need? Is it the need of the education system to ensure that all children are gaining high standards? So children who have got behaviour needs are then positioned as being a problem. Are they seen as being a threat to those standards within school? So actually, whose needs are they? Is the fact that a child's got behaviour needs, is it the fault of the child, or is it because they've had adverse childhood experiences, they've got unmet needs, maybe they've experienced some trauma, maybe they're being exposed to a curriculum that doesn't meet their needs. Maybe they're being labelled by the assessment system as being a failure. So the problems sometimes are not necessarily within the person. The problems can be external to the individual, but then the child gets the label of having the behaviour needs. So I think that's a really interesting debate. And sometimes children with behaviour needs are seen as being a threat to the whole school standards. So let's label them as having behaviour needs and remove them from the school so they don't threaten the standards of everybody else. So then is that the needs of the school or the needs of the child? And I think it's good to really critique some of the terminology. And I just wanted to talk about exclusion. So, I mean, obviously with you can't really talk about inclusion without talking about exclusion. But in England, we're seeing more and more exclusions, permanent exclusions, 10,885 exclusions. I've done a hyperlink to the data there. I think that was 2024, 2023, 24. In Wales, now let's have a look. This is a graph from Wales. So we can see that we see a sharp increase from 2011-12. It's going right up in 2017-18. Then it drops. And then in 2020, there's a sharp rise, and that's after COVID. So since COVID, we're seeing a sharp rise in exclusions. Now, the problem with exclusions is that it places children on a school to prison pipeline. This is well documented in the literature. So children are sent out of class, they're sent into detention, isolation, they have temporary exclusions or suspensions, which then leads to permanent exclusions, and then they're placed in alternative provision or pupil referral units, and eventually they find them, lots of them find themselves in young offenders institutions. And this is very, very well documented in the literature, that the effect of school exclusion is that it can place children on a pathway into prison. Okay, now often when we think about SEND, we think that everything's really inclusive. We think that all the processes around SEND are really inclusive, and it's all about meeting the needs of the child. But I just want you to problematize it and think critically. So often SEND, or additional learning needs practices in schools, are associated with some of these things on the right hand side. So they're associated with sending children out of class, children having interventions, small group interventions, one-to-one interventions, individual education plans, right, labelling and diagnosis. Now, a lot of the literature critiques these processes and says that what this does is this creates an othered group. Sorry, that was a pheasant outside. It's making a very loud noise. It creates an othered group. Basically, it separates them out from their peers. And, labelling a child, although labelling and diagnosing a child can open up opportunities for funding and support, in a way, it also separates them out from their peers and makes them different and creates this othering effect. And then also additional learning needs, or SEND, is associated with educational psychologists, who then come in and they carry out assessments on the child, and they do interventions and all of that. And this is very much aligned with a medical model of disability. So a lot of the processes that are associated with SEND are actually operating at the level of the child rather than the level of the system or the level of the school. And therefore, it could be argued that the whole system is operating a medical model, and because the whole focus is about the child, whereas there probably needs to be much more focus on the schooling system, the education system, the curriculum, the assessment, and everything else, to make all those things more inclusive. So that's one thing I'd like you to do, is to think critically about some of these practices, because the temptation is that students will often at master's level, they'll write and think that all these things are brilliant, and in a way they are, but in another way they can also create forms of exclusion. And this has been talked about a lot in the literature. So I just wanted to remind you about the social model of disability. So the social model argues that disability is socially created. Now, what students often get stuck on is why that is. Okay, so let me just explain this to you. Okay, so before the social model, we had a medical model. Now, I've just argued that a lot of the processes that are happening in schools actually are still reflecting a medical model. There's still a focus on, assessing, diagnosing, providing interventions at the level of the child, which is very much a bit like a doctor going to see a patient, and the patient being given a course of treatment. In a way, the education system is still like that. It's still very much reflecting that medical model. But in the 1970s, the late 1970s and the early 1980s, a group of disabled activists and academics and researchers pushed for a social model of disability. They said, we're sick of actually being blamed for the problem, and the problem being positioned within our bodies. So we're sick of people saying that the problem is with us. So what the social model does is it says that disability is actually a social construct. It's socially created because it separates two fundamental concepts. So it separates impairment from disability. Okay, so let me just explain this to you then. So impairment is something within the body. right? So it's within person. It could be a physical impairment, it could be an impairment in the brain, it could be an impairment, a hearing impairment, it could be a visual impairment, something within the body, right? But disability in the social model is completely separate. So disability is all about access, access to goods, access to services, access to education, access to health services, access to housing, access to employment. So what the social model then does is it says, if somebody is denied access to education, housing, employment, to any service, then they are disabled. But they're not disabled because of their impairment. They're disabled because society hasn't made the correct adjustments to meet their needs. Okay, so an example would be that a person with a physical impairment is denied access to a building because there isn't a ramp or a lift in the building to enable them to access that building. That's one example, but there are lots of other examples. So disability is all about access, and therefore, if people who are disabled, they're disabled because society hasn't enabled the access, and therefore disability is socially constructed and socially created. It does acknowledge that people have impairments which are within the body, but actually disability is something totally different. So what we're then doing through school, by providing additional resources and by providing lifts and ramps and by providing braille and providing all the different types of interventions that you deliver in school, is we are playing out the social model in action. We are making adjustments to facilitate access to the curriculum, access to education, right? So the child is then not disabled. Yes, they have an impairment, but they're not disabled because they've been allowed access, because the adjustments have been made. So the social model arguably was an emancipatory force in the lives of many disabled people because it took disability out of the body and it placed it within society. So all the adaptations that we see in school and society are examples of the social model in action. But the potential of the social model hasn't been fully realised in education because there hasn't been a fundamental system change. Because arguably you could say some children are still denied access to education because the curriculum isn't inclusive, the assessment system isn't inclusive. There hasn't been that political response, and therefore the social model hasn't been realised. And those children are still disadvantaged because then they're not able to access the education system because the education system itself is not inclusive. Okay, so the government direction at the moment in England is that they want mainstream schools to become more inclusive. They want more SEND or additional learning needs training in ITE programmes. However, the politicians don't know which models of inclusion work best in mainstream schools, and they're not sure how to measure inclusion. So they're not actually sure what they're talking about. And I know that because I was invited to a meeting at the Department for Education, and they said, we don't know. We don't know what models of inclusion work. We don't know what it looks like. We don't know how to measure it. How do you measure inclusion? Well, what they wanted was they wanted us to say you need to measure it by one thing like attainment. But actually, inclusion is a bit more complicated than that. Maybe you can't measure it by one thing. Okay, so those are the key points. I'll stop sharing.
Fantastic. That was really, really insightful. Thanks, Jonathan. And a good springboard, I think lots of food for thought, and a good springboard for this broader discussion. So I'm going to start with some of those kind of pre-shared questions with you, Jonathan. So the first one is, the title of this module is ALN, Excellence in Practice. Can you tell us what you think excellence in practice looks like?
So I think I think it'll mean different things for different people, essentially, and that's fine. I think people have different interpretations of inclusion, and I think that's fine. But for me, I think personally, it means having expert teachers or expert staff working with children. So obviously, you need that deep knowledge of additional learning needs, and that's crucial. But for me, it's also about having a personalised education. So um, making sure that making sure they're not being rushed through a curriculum, making sure that the curriculum is meeting their needs, making sure that those pivotal foundational knowledge and skills that children need are really embedded before we then move on to the next thing in the curriculum. I think that's really key. I think in some schools there's a temptation to rush children through the curriculum, and I think for children with additional learning needs, we need to make sure that those foundations are in place, and we need opportunities to overlearn some of that content so that children develop fluency with that content. I think it's about children being happy. Um, there's no point in talking about inclusion if children are not happy, if they don't feel safe, if they don't have a sense of belonging. I think it's about attending to their holistic needs as well. I think that's really important. It's not just about their academic needs. So I think if I was measuring inclusion, I'd be looking for those things. I'd be looking for, do the children have a sense of belonging? Are their broad needs being catered for? You know, are we looking after them intellectually, academically, socially, emotionally, etc.? Have they got a personalised education? So yeah, those things.
Fab, fab. And thinking about that, like the next question is asking you for specific examples, I guess. So
Yeah.
have you got any examples that you could share with us of what you consider to be excellent practice, and why, what made it excellent?
Yeah, I do go into schools quite a lot, so I can talk about what I've seen in schools. So last year I went into a school in Hartlepool in the northeast of England, and this was it was a challenging context. So there was lots of social problems in the community, and the children needed a lot of support with social and emotional regulation. And what they developed was they developed a nurture provision. Actually, they developed two nurture provisions. So one for children in Key Stage 1 and one for children in Key Stage 2. So one for sort of 5 to 7 year olds and then another one for juniors. And so what they did was the children, they were not in their main class, right? So they went into the nurture provision, and they spent a lot of time in there working with, there was a very strong focus on relational approaches and building up good relationships between the adults and the children. So they learned some of those basic skills around turn taking, sharing, playing, communication. There was a big focus on like play-based learning and developing social and emotional regulation. So they were learning about feelings and emotions and how to manage feelings, and they were being given strategies for managing their feelings. And the curriculum was it wasn't delivered quite in the same way that it was delivered in the other classes. It was more flexible, it was more personalized. There was a big focus on play-based learning. But when the children were ready, they were then reintegrated back into their year group classes. And so for some children, they spent quite a lot of time in the nurture provision before being integrated back into their classes. But the view of the school was, we'll integrate them back into the class when we feel they're ready and when they can thrive. So what then happened is, when they were ready to transition back into the year group class, there was a big celebration event where the child was like formally handed over to the class, and um, the child was introduced to the class, and they talked about what the child was, what the child liked doing and the child's interests and the child's hobbies and all of that. So the class got to know them, and then they were handed over. And what then happened, because I was a bit worried, because I thought, well, what curriculum have they been missing while they've been in this nurture provision? But what became very clear was that when they were reintegrated back into the year group class, because they were ready to learn, they absolutely caught up with everybody else. So the view of the school was, if we don't get this right and focus on their social and emotional learning initially, then they'll never be ready to be reintegrated. So I thought that was really excellent provision. And the other one was, I was in a school about 3 weeks ago, and they developed their own resource provision for children with complex SEND needs. So I think they've got 8 children in this resource provision. So they developed basically a classroom, and they'd staffed it. And for the children who were really struggling in the mainstream classes, they put them into this. It was called EiP, this educational resource provision. And again, it was much more of a nurturing approach, much more of a relational approach, much more focus on a personalised education. So the children had a personalised curriculum. They were learning in small groups or individually. They had visual timetables. They had now and next boards, so they knew, what they were doing next. It was really structured. And the reason they developed that was because there was a lack of those provisions in the local authority, essentially. So they just developed their own, and it was really good. So when I went in there, the children were all regulated. They were happy, they were thriving, but they were not thriving when they were in their main class. So I thought that was excellent. And what then happened was they did get some of the children then from the rest of the school to sometimes go into that resource provision and work with those children. So they were mixing. They were also mixing with them at playtimes and social times and lunch times. So they were not completely separate. They did mix with them, and sometimes they did integrate with them in the lessons. So there was like partial integration into the lessons, but it was an opportunity really to focus on their social and emotional regulation.
Yeah, they both sound like really great examples, like you say, that giving them the opportunity to focus on what they need to focus on right now,
Yeah,
and that flexibility of reintegration when it's right for the
when it's
child, rather
appropriate.
than
Yeah.
yeah. Quite often these sorts of provisions operate on a time frame, don't they? Like a revolving door type mechanism where there's an expectation after 6 months they'll return, or after one term they'll return, and it's doesn't fit with the needs of the children necessarily at all.
Can take longer.
Yeah, absolutely. So how can we measure excellence? As you said, excellence in practice means different things in different contexts. People have different perceptions. And you were talking earlier about, the government in England wanting to know, how do we measure inclusion? It's a similar question, isn't it? When schools are being asked to evidence excellence in practice and share that practice, how can we measure it?
Well, I think again, I mean, the word measurement is problematic, isn't it? I think. Because often we're not measuring the hard things, we're measuring the soft things. So, I mean, you can measure inclusion by looking at progress that children make. The actual, how far have they moved from their starting point? You could measure it through attainment. So, although I don't think that's a very good measure, but actually, how are they attaining in terms of national expectations? I don't think that's a good measure of inclusion. What I would be doing is I would be talking to the parents. I'd want the views of the parents, I'd want the views of the children, I'd want the views of the staff, and I'd be asking them about their sense of belonging, their happiness. To me, those are the soft things that I would be measuring, because I think they're really important. But I think the government are really interested in those hard measures of inclusion. So they're interested in, well, how many children with additional learning needs, how are they attaining at the end of their schooling? How many are going on to further education? How many are going into higher education? How many are going into employment? I think they're interested in those measures, because what we know is that for many, many years, the numbers of those children accessing those opportunities has been far too low. And long-term outcomes for children with disabilities have been poor. So the government are interested in those hard measures, but I'm interested. Yes, I'm interested in their progress from their starting point. I think that's important, but I'm also interested in how they feel, their happiness, their sense of belonging. I'm interested in the views of the parents, because often parents are more interested in, well, they're interested in how their children are settling. Are they settled? Are they happy? Have they got friends? You can measure it through that, can't you?
Yeah. Yeah. So many kind of pieces to the jigsaw puzzle, I guess, of perspectives and perceptions.
And there was another part to that question, if I can just, and if I can just, about
Yeah.
how to communicate this to others. So I'm working with a consortium of schools at the moment, and I'm working with a group of additional learning needs coordinators who are doing action research projects in their settings. And I'll share one example. So she is an intervention teacher, this colleague that I'm working with. So she works with children with dyslexia, and she has taught the children. So she's taught the children with dyslexia about what they struggle with, what the barriers to learning are, and how teachers can help them. She's also spoke to some parents. So she's done some interviews with parents. She's also spoke to some additional learning needs coordinators. And what she's done is she's produced from those discussions, particularly the discussions with the children, she's turned it into an animation. Don't ask me how she did it, but she's turned it into like a 5-minute animation, which is showcasing the views of the children. And she's going to share that across all of her schools, because it's just a 5-minute clip, so everybody can listen to what the children have had to say. And then she's creating a website, and on that website she's putting loads of resources to support all the teachers with how to support children with dyslexia. So she's putting loads of stuff on the website. So that's a way of disseminating, isn't it? Developing resources to support colleagues.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's something in that, like, as you say, the length of it, it's only 5 minutes.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
almost, especially in this day and age, where we've all got much shorter attention spans. It's like
yeah,
if we
yeah,
can crowbar it into a
yeah,
shorter window and make it accessible, then yeah, it just helps to make it more get a wider reach, doesn't it? That
yeah.
sounds like a fantastic project. Okay, so the next question, Jonathan, what are the benefits and challenges of ensuring whole setting consistent excellence in practice?
I think consistency is really key anyway for children, so they're not confused essentially. So as they move through the school, I think consistent approaches and consistent practice really benefits children because it gives them reassurance, and I think that's important. I think the challenges, I think there's a few challenges. So I think teachers have different interpretations of inclusion. So, and also teachers have different attitudes towards inclusion as well, and different attitudes towards children with additional learning needs. So that can be a challenge, that can be a barrier sometimes. I think another challenge can be the pressure on teachers to achieve academic standards, because what that can sometimes result in is basically racing through children through a curriculum far too quickly, because they've got this pressure to meet those standards or to achieve those standards. And what that can then mean is that the children, they're rushed too quickly through the curriculum, and they don't have the foundational knowledge in place really to enable them to move on to something new. So I think that's a challenge. I think there's always challenges around whether children have got enough support in the classroom, and
Yeah.
as children are moving through the school, there might be some support in one class, but there might not be support in another class in terms of teaching assistant support. I think one of the challenges then is also ensuring that teachers have got knowledge, that they're all knowledge, that they've all got knowledge, they're all trained. They all understand how to support children with autism, for example, or children with dyslexia. I think, ensuring that consistency of expertise across the school can sometimes be a challenge. So yeah, I think there's quite a few challenges there in terms of consistency. But I don't think they're not also carbon copies. So, we do want individuality as well. That's important, I would say.
Yeah, that's something we just very briefly touched on in the earlier session about, what works in one classroom doesn't necessarily work in another, or one school to another, or it is all very context dependent, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think just to add to that point, Anne, I think just because you've read about dyslexia or autism and you've read about some strategies that support children with autism doesn't mean that those strategies will work for every child with autism or every child with dyslexia, and doesn't mean that all of those strategies are appropriate for those children. So I think it's always bearing in mind that children are individuals, and yes, they may have a label, they might share a label, but you know what works for one child won't necessarily work for another, and what works in one school might not work in another. So it's all very context specific, I think.
Yeah, that's really key, isn't it?
Yeah.
Thinking about practice in relation to ALN, is there evidence, do you think, of blaming the learner, the student, the pupil, rather than blaming the teaching when challenges arise?
I think this happens a lot for children with behavioural needs. I think often children get blamed for that, particularly in secondary schools. Sorry, that was a huge sweeping generalisation, but there's such a big focus on compliance in terms of behaviour, and children not allowed to talk, and they're not, it's really, really tight in schools. And often the child is then blamed for their behaviour, but I think in most cases the reason they're behaving in certain ways is because they've got unmet needs. We could go back to Maslow and Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and I think some of those children haven't had stable backgrounds, they haven't felt loved, they haven't felt cared for, they haven't been surrounded by good role models at home. So their physiological and psychological needs haven't been met. They may have experienced trauma. They may have experienced disrupted parenting and disrupted education because they may be moved around different schools. So I think a lot of the times behaviour I think it can be a form of communication. It's communicating unmet needs. And some of the time also children behave in certain ways because of the relationships they form with teachers. Sometimes those relationships aren't positive, and that can trigger certain behavioural responses. And sometimes children just don't enjoy what they're learning in school. So the curriculum isn't meeting their needs, it's too academic, it's not vocational enough. They're labelled as failures through the assessment system because there's often such a focus on academic assessment and academic outcomes. So I think all of those factors can contribute to behaviour. And I feel that often it's the child who gets blamed for their behaviour. Yeah, so I think we also need to question, particularly in terms of behaviour, often what schools want is they want to remove those children with the most challenging behaviour. I mean, not all schools. Some schools will do the best to keep children, but some schools do want to remove those children. And that's interesting, isn't it? That's really interesting, because actually what we then end up with is an overrepresentation of children with special educational needs in pupil referral units. And so far too many children with additional learning needs are being excluded. And that then it's no surprise that a third of young offenders have got literacy difficulties or other kinds of learning difficulties because those children have been excluded from schools. So I think it's really interesting, but I think behaviour is often where we blame the student.
Yeah, I think that's true. And it was interesting as well that the bit that you explored earlier around the school to prison pipeline, and the literature around, and starting with the smaller scale exclusions within because
Yes.
it's often there, isn't it, with the removal from the classroom,
Yeah.
removal. And no, I worked in a school a few years back where the place that they sent the challenging children that weren't complying to expectations in the classroom, they actually called it the inclusion room, but it was very much where they were sent to be excluded from the
Yeah.
classroom.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah, and it starts with that lower level experience, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So moving on then to the next question. How do you feel about the proposition inclusion is a good idea in theory, but not good for all in practice? You touched on this earlier in your presentation, actually.
Mm. I think it depends what we mean by inclusion. So if we're saying that inclusion is about mainstreaming children and putting all children into mainstream schools, then actually that's not good for all, because some children have very, very complex needs, and actually a mainstream school is not the right learning environment for them. So I'm thinking, for example, children with profound and multiple learning disabilities or children with complex autism.
Yeah.
Mainstream school may not be suitable. But so I think if we then say, well, actually, inclusion it's not about the location where a child is or the type of school they go to. It's just about quality of education. We can then have quality of education. We can then say, well, actually, if a child goes to a special school, special schools can be inclusive. Um, just because they've gone to a special school doesn't mean that practice in there is not inclusive, because often it's very inclusive. So I think it's problematic, but I would say, from my experience, so is inclusion a good idea in theory but not good in practice for all? I think generally it's about quality of education. And if we get good inclusive education for children with additional learning needs, I think that benefits all children. I think often what works for children with additional learning needs will work for all children. And I think it's also good for children to be exposed to difference and diversity, and you know, to realize and understand that people are different and not everybody's the same. And I think that helps to then create a more socially inclusive society. I've always been interested in how primary schools do such a lot to support inclusion, and they keep children often with quite complex needs, but then those children don't end up going to their local secondary school. They often then go to some kind of alternative provision. So I think that's an interesting one. But I think it's good for children to be exposed to difference.
Yeah, yeah, and I think there's real value in it. And I think as well, you were saying about it depends on what your kind of uh, what the concept of inclusion means. And I think thinking back to what you were saying earlier about if you were to measure inclusion, it would be from those elements like belonging,
Yeah.
happiness,
Holistic needs. Yeah.
yeah, it would be all of that. And so yeah, if that's how we perceive inclusion as being something where when it's successful there are the senses of belonging and happiness and being able to progress and access to curriculum that is appropriate and works, etc., then as you say, then inclusion is a good idea,
Mm.
and could work for all. um Okay. Uh, I'm mindful of time, so we'll do two more of these questions, and then we'll open it up. So how can individual voices contribute to cohesive, excellent practice? And are there challenges to ensuring this, especially thinking about when we are all working in very multi-agency ways these days? So
Mm. I think that individuals can do a lot. You can share your practice with other people. Um, and you can think about how you do that. So you can blog about what you're doing. You can you can talk on podcasts. All of this helps to communicate and disseminate what you're doing. So you can write about what you're doing and publish it, sharing practice, but also forming networks with other people. So other additional learning needs coordinators, and learning through sharing practice, I think, is also really powerful. So I think individuals can do a lot in terms of having individual voices and communicating that message. So I think individuals can do a lot, but I think there is power in coming together, forming groups, forming networks, and sharing good practice through networks, attending conferences, and so on. I think all of that is beneficial.
And what about the specific challenges arising from working across multiple agencies? Have you seen any good practice out there in terms of making those communications more?
I think there's always, there's not enough services. There's been too many cutbacks to services, and therefore services can't meet demand. That's the biggest issue we're struggling with at the moment. Is we're expecting teachers to do everything when actually we need to be relying on those services. We need to be relying on mental health services to meet the demand, and we can't rely on them. In terms of good practice, I think a lot of the good practice you see is actually within schools. Some schools have actually, I've been in schools where they've got the services on site. So some of the multi-academy trusts in England are actually appointing their own sort of experts. So they're recruiting their own educational psychologists, and they're recruiting their own dyslexia trained specialist, and they're actually what that then means is those services are actually on site, which I think is really, really helpful, because it's really hard to get external people in, and they've got massive caseloads as well to deal with. So having them on site, having access to an educational psychologist on site, having access to a dyslexia trained teacher, or a mental health practitioner, or a counsellor on site, all of that is really helpful. So I think that's where the good practice exists, when it's sort of, I think in England, I don't know about Wales, whether it's the same or similar, but they've developed the role of the education mental health practitioner. So these are graduates who do a postgraduate course, and they train in mental health. They learn about cognitive behaviour therapy. They learn about low intensity interventions. Once they've done their postgraduate training, they have to do placements as part of that, and it's a funded qualification. But they're then employed by the NHS, but they're placed into schools so that they can offer in-school support for children with mental health needs. And they can do things that teachers can't do. So they can deliver cognitive behaviour therapy and counselling that the educators wouldn't be allowed to do. They can deliver sound therapy and art therapy because they're qualified in those therapeutic interventions. So I think that's a really good example, but the problem is there aren't enough of them. They need to be in every single school, and they're in about a quarter of schools at the moment.
Right, that does sound like a really useful resource. Yeah, I don't think, to my knowledge, we've got anything similar. Although there is a huge kind of focus, Public Health Wales and Welsh Government working together, looking at a community focused schools model to localize delivery in areas to make it more accessible, to avoid families having to travel an hour and a half on a bus to an appointment, and etc. But yeah, okay. Final.
Children would rather get the support in school rather than going to a clinic, wouldn't they?
Yeah, absolutely, and there are definitely discussions in Wales about, can we have school-based access to, and what services could we facilitate on site? What would that look like, and what's possible? So yeah, but we haven't gone as far down the track as you guys have in England yet with that. Okay, last question from me then, Jonathan, and we'll open it up to everybody else. What advice would you give to an aspiring additional learning needs coordinator and practitioners in achieving excellence in ALN practices?
I would say form networks so that you can work with other people and share ideas and share practice. You don't have to do this alone. Talk to other people. Stay curious, stay interested, keep learning. Avoid off-the-shelf strategies for children with particular labels. You know, all children with dyslexia will not respond to the same intervention. So keep remembering that these are individuals. But I think just keep interested is the key thing, isn't it? Because you can have as much training as forever. You can have training forever and ever in additional learning needs, but it's only when you're actually working with children in the classroom that's when you need the training at that point, isn't it, to help you support the children you're dealing with. So I think just keep an open mind and just look for opportunities. So join organisations like the National Association of Special Educational Needs, NASON. I don't know if you're a member of that, but they share a lot of good practice. Look for free CPD, grab all the free CPD you can do, and don't forget to push yourself forward and start to share what you're doing with other people, and because I think that's really important.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think that openness, that staying curious is crucial, isn't it? Being
Yeah,
willing to
yeah,
seek out and find out and think about and
yeah.
yeah.
And what I would also say is you don't have to have all the answers, because sometimes there might not be any answers, or there might be multiple answers. So don't think, oh, well, I'm the expert, I'm the additional learning needs coordinator, I need to know everything. Sometimes it's okay just to have a conversation about it. Even be honest with parents and say, well, I'm not an expert in this, I need to research it. I think that kind of openness and honesty is really, really important.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. Fantastic. Well, we're going to open it up to everybody else in the group now. So if you have got any questions, either stick your hand up or unmute your mic and chip in, or post questions in the chat. We've got a little pocket of 10 minutes now if anybody's got anything they want to ask Jonathan.
Don't ask me anything hard.
It's too hot for hard questions.
I've got one. Is there anything, like that we can do to challenge, say, practitioners, to say, like, I've got a lot of knowledge standing around complex needs through my own children, hence why I did ALN. So how do we challenge somebody that is set in their ways?
Do you mean Kelly? Is it Kelly?
Yeah,
Do you mean as a parent?
no, as a practitioner.
Could you give me a bit more information there?
So say like we've got a setting that is struggling through, obviously, supporting a learner with, say, complex needs, and we've got to go through that long process. How do we challenge, say, higher practitioners to push that through the setting to make it more better for the learner?
I think you've got to make yourself really annoying, haven't you? Because often people they'll put obstacles in your way, and they'll try not to progress things because they're worried that things are not going to progress or they haven't got the funding for it. And I think you've got to collect all the evidence that you possibly can to demonstrate the need there to advance it further. So I think if you've got the evidence and you've got the parents on side as well, and you've had good discussions with them, and you've also got all the evidence that you need, I think you just have to make yourself really annoying there and just carry on in a professional way.
And is there anything, you know, I can't think of the word, but an overqualified teaching assistant, you know, because they've got, say, like, obviously that everyone says I've got a wide knowledge and understanding, and someone says, oh, well, you've probably got too much, if that makes sense.
Well,
Is there anything that
I don't think that what does an overqualified teaching assistant mean? I mean, we actually need teaching assistants to be more knowledgeable and more skilled to deal with the complexity of the needs that they're meeting. So I think that's a good thing.
yeah,
And if people are saying you're overqualified, well, I don't know what that means, to be
yeah.
honest. I think that's just professional jealousy, to be honest.
Yeah, I have been told I'm too overqualified on some things, and I'm like, oh,
Yeah,
what does that mean then? Because is that I know too much, or is it
yeah,
because I'm continually, you know, I'll do anything, you know, if I can find anything training wise, I will do it no matter
yeah,
what.
yeah, I agree. I think you have to push back on that and say, well, if I'm overqualified, that's great because anyway, you can't be overqualified. You need because we're dealing with more and more complex needs, so we need people with the knowledge and the expertise to be able to support the children. So I would just push back on that.
Okay, cheers.
Anybody else? I think everybody's flagging in the heat. Yeah, it was really, really fantastic. Okay, so what we'll do is we'll finish there and we'll break for lunch. So you've got a sneaky extra 9 minutes on you, the lucky
Oh.
ones, on your lunch break.